in the middle of the night, I woke up. She came to that intersection of the ley lines in the middle of that field, and she just dropped her dowsing rods to her side, and she goes, "Oh my God, this is where he comes to talk to the aliens." I'm Forrest Crawford. Been a lifelong UFO researcher ever since I was like 13 years old. I've been researching the phenomenon, been involved in one way or another all these years. Um, and my Bigfoot story, it's not terribly exciting, but whenever I was 13, I was camping at Camp Ondasank, which is a summer camp in southern Illinois in the Shawnee National Forest. And during the 2 weeks that I was camping there, we would go out on an overnight excursion. So we would hike out and we would carry our stuff with us, and then we would sleep overnight and then come back the next day. And so when we did that, we were out in the middle of the woods, and the camp staff person that was with us was telling us stories around the campfire, and they were telling us a lot of Bigfoot stories, mainly about things that had happened in that area in the Shawnee National Forest. And there typically over the years there have been a lot of Bigfoot sightings in that area. And so he told us about some of the goings on that happened down there, and then eventually we all went to sleep, and there were maybe about 18 of us or so, and we were just sleeping on the ground underneath a lean-to. And in the middle of the night, I woke up, and I was awakened by the sound of this thumping, very heavy footprints, walking around maybe 25 or 30 feet away from where we were all laying in a group under this lean-to, walking around in a circle around us. And you could hear these very heavy footsteps. And I got my flashlight out and I turned it on and pointed it to where I could hear the footsteps. And the footsteps stopped, and then there was nothing there. I couldn't see anything. I turned the flashlight off. The footsteps would resume going in this circle. Every time I would try to shine the flashlight on it, they would stop, and I could never see anything. There was this very powerful, very pervasive smell, like a dumpster, like a garbage, type dumpster. Not a typical smell that you would smell in the woods on a nice summer day. And I guess since then I have learned that that is something that's very commonly reported when people see a Bigfoot. So I didn't see a Bigfoot, but it sure seemed like there was one walking around where we were camping. And at one point, even I thought the camp staff guy was, pulling a joke on us because he'd been telling us these stories. And so I looked around, and he was laying there on the ground asleep with the rest of us. And so there was nobody up walking around. And then I've also heard stories from people since then that that um, that have had Bigfoot encounters, that they will test your sort of response to them before they will let you see them. And so they're gauging, what your emotional response is before they actually allow you to see them. So that was sort of typical of my experience as well.
I see. Well, I know that you have had a lot more experience in the UFO community, or at least research in the UFO community. And I'm especially interested in one case that was kind of an ongoing investigation with someone that you refer to as Oscar. Would you tell us that story?
Yeah, probably the most extraordinary UFO slash alien case that I've ever investigated. And it took place here in Missouri, a very rural part of north central Missouri. And the whole thing started actually with Stanton Friedman. He was giving a speech at a conference in Florida, and yeah, obviously he always talks about Roswell. So when he was at his table signing books, this guy came up to him and said, "Hey, I used to be neighbors with a guy who claimed that he was involved in a crash retrieval operation whenever he was in the military. It wasn't Roswell, it was later, but he claimed to have been, part of a military group that responded to a crash. And so Stanton, tried to get information out of the guy, and basically he says, the only thing I know is his name's Oscar, and he lives in this town in Missouri. Okay, and that's all we had to go on. So Stanton called Bruce Whitman, at the time was the state director of for MUFON for Missouri. Stanton called up Bruce and says, here's the story, gave him the tiny bits of information. And Bruce contacted me. I was the state director for Illinois MUFON, and a couple of other investigators from here in Missouri. And Bruce and one of the other investigators went up to this small town to try and find this guy with nothing more than his first name, and that he had this weird story about being in the military. So they went up there. There's like one little gas station, convenience mart in town. This is a very small town. They decided to go in. That might be the best place to go in and ask about this person. So they went in and they inquired. There was one other person in the convenience store when they were talking to the clerk about this, that person overheard them and came over to them and said, well, I think I know who the guy is that you're looking for, and I know where he lives. And so they're like, okay, so they follow this guy up the road to this small house, and they pull in there and they bang on the door, and this guy comes out and talks to him, and they explain they're looking for some guy who had this military background where he was involved with a crash retrieval operation with a UFO. And the guy, at first he says, he goes, well, I'm not that person, but I think I know who you're talking about. And he carried on a conversation with them for about another half an hour, 45 minutes. And then he finally fessed up and says, yeah, actually I am the guy. I just didn't want, anybody to really know my identity, but you guys seem all right. And so he outed himself and admitted that he was the person they were looking for. And so then Bruce contacted me and another investigator and said, we want you guys to come up with us and meet this guy. So we went up there, we met him and his mom and started hearing his story. And so his story goes that would have been in the late 50s, he was in a military unit, sort of like a Delta team. Their job was to respond as a security force if there was like a downed aircraft. So if a jet fighter or something went down, his team would be the perimeter guard to keep people out while they investigated and cleaned up the wreckage. And he said that him and his crew were stationed at the Comtre submarine base in San Diego. And they got orders to deploy to be a part of a security team around a crash retrieval. And he says that they went to a lower level below that submarine base and did what they call in the military shoot the tubes, is the way he described it. And what that was is apparently there's an underground tunnel network with shuttles that go all over the United States, apparently. And so they got in the tubes. Sorry. Springtime pollen is getting to me a little bit. So they get in these cars, if you will, these shuttle trains, and it shoots them to another location. Well, he says normally when you shoot the tubes, they make you take all the metal off of your body, like watches and rings, or if you're carrying any weapons or anything like that, and put it in a container. And they explain that it's because the magnetic field that this tube shuttle system generates can cause metal objects to spark and do things like that. So they take them away from you. Well, he was curious about where they were going, so he snuck his watch in his pocket and kept it. and noted the time when they left and noted the time when they got out. And when they got out of the tube shuttle, 20 minutes had passed, and they had gone from San Diego, California, to near Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. So if you do the math on that, that's 4,000 miles an hour in some underground tunnel system. So they got out of the shuttle there. They took them to this hangar where this disc-shaped object was already in the hangar, where they had retrieved it and brought it there to that base for research. And he said it looked like it was intact and that there wasn't anything wrong with it. And so him and his team's job was to enter that craft. When they opened it, his team was to be the first ones to go inside as the security team and make sure that it was safe. So if there was any aliens in there, they were to, to be the poor souls that would encounter them first, if you will. So he said there was a guy named Professor Bear, is what they called him, and he had Professor Bear had a very unusual background in like physics and psychology and a couple of other disciplines, and he used a device that emitted sound waves. And he tuned these sound waves, and when he got them tuned just right, he said the side of the ship rippled like when you throw a pebble in the water, it rippled as if it was like liquid, and then it opened up. And he was the first one to go into the craft. And inside the ship, apparently when the ship crashed or crash landed, it didn't hurt the outside of it, but the inside of the ship buckled. It's like the interior had shifted. There was a live alien sitting at a sort of a bench or a seat against the wall. When the interior of the ship buckled, it pinned his leg under a fold of the metal of the inside of the ship, and so he couldn't get up. So Oscar approached the alien, and as soon as like the alien was completely human in appearance. Like he says, you couldn't, tell them apart from anybody else if they were walking through the mall. And as he approached the alien started communicating with him telepathically. And so Oscar apparently was able to communicate easily with this alien. So some other people came in shortly after that. They unpinned the alien from the side of the ship and put him on a stretcher and took him out of there. And Oscar became the translator for this alien because he was able to communicate with the being so easily. Not everybody could do that. So he was assigned to be the communicator, the liaison between the research team there and the alien. And so they tried to give the alien normal analgesics to numb the pain that the alien was in from its injury. However, they had no effect on the pain of the alien. So that did not stop them from going ahead and doing experimental surgery on this being to learn about its anatomy. Even though they couldn't anesthetize the being, they just strapped it down and started doing surgery on it to find out about it. And you can imagine how horrible and painful that was for this being. So at some point, Oscar was very, very upset and disgusted about how they were treating this being. So they came to get the alien one time to do more experimentation on him, and Oscar stood his ground and pulled his service revolver and said, "You're not going to hurt this guy anymore." And so he was then promptly removed from the project and sent to a psychiatric hospital in the Northeast, where he was debriefed for 3 months and then was honorably discharged and booted out of the military. So the the alien being, I should say the race of aliens, then started contacting Oscar and staying in touch with him, and continued to contact him physically and psychically, if you will, for all the years after that happened in the late 60s. I mean, sorry, the late 50s, up to the time that we met him, which was in the 80s. I'm sorry, 90s, early 90s. Get my get my times right. But they were still in contact with him, and he said that the person that was in charge of this military operation was a civilian contractor, and that civilian contractor was Frank Drake. So one of the things we did, which is a pretty extraordinary claim, Frank Drake never claimed to have any official military duties of any kind. But he says that was the guy that was calling the shots, was okaying this experimental surgery on this being and all that kind of stuff. He was apparently in charge of whatever the military projects were to capture, sequester, retrieve aliens and alien technology. And so to test this, because we thought that's a pretty bold claim to make, we took a stack of pictures up there, like 12 or 15 people, just random folks. Some of them were UFO researchers, some were baseball players, some of them were politicians, and one of them was a picture of Frank Drake. And we just handed him the stack of pictures and said, hey, look through these pictures and tell me, what you think or how you feel about any of these people. And he just went through them, and it's like, I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is. Oh, I think he's a baseball player. And when he came to the picture of Frank Drake, he got visibly upset. He threw the picture down on the table and he goes, that's the son of a bitch that was ordering the experiments on Hank. Hank was the nickname that he gave the alien. So that started the adventure with this guy. Okay. So he was very, very guarded. He did not want anybody to know who he was or where he lived. He swore us all to secrecy. And so far in this interview, you've noticed I haven't mentioned the name of the town that he lived in. He doesn't live in that town anymore, but the last time I knew of him, he lived fairly nearby in another town. And just to respect his wishes, he did not want a lot of people coming up and poking around and getting nosy with him telling this story to us. He made us swear that we would never bring anybody up there to meet him without his prior approval. And we challenged them. We said, well, look, you live a fairly sheltered life. You're not going to know who any of these people are that we might want to bring up here. He goes, it doesn't matter. You clear it with me first. And if they're okay for me to talk to, they'll tell me it's okay. And like, who do you mean they'll tell you it's okay? Like the aliens will say, this person's okay to talk to. And so over the investigation with him went on for 7 years. I would go up to see him anywhere between 2 and 4 times a year for 7 years, and interview him about different stuff. And we would occasionally go, hey, can we bring this person up? And he would almost always say no, but occasionally he would say yes. And so the small circle of the 4 original investigators grew by 2 or 3 other people is all. But he didn't even want us to bring other UFO researchers up there that were interested in the case. He was just really, really protective of his identity and his family. And so that's the basic story. We could go on for about another 4 hours if you want to hear all the strange things that happened when we were up there. And I can tell you there was never once that I went up there to talk to him that something weird didn't happen. And that included seeing UFOs, meeting a child that was in his care that spoke an unrecognizable language. This was like maybe a 2 to 3 year old. that spoke this bizarre language. I'm not a linguistics expert, but I couldn't even tell you it sounded like French or it sounded like Russian. It was just completely different. And at first, when we saw this kid running around while we were talking to Oscar, um, we thought it was just gibberish. Well, then the kid would come over and jump in Oscar's lap and talk to him, and Oscar would answer him in this same weird language. And like they would carry on a conversation, and then the kid would get up and run around and play in the yard or whatever. And so the next time we went out there, the kid wasn't there anymore. We're like, hey, what happened to the child that was out here last time? Who was that? And he goes, oh, I was asked to take care of that child for a while and teach him some stuff. And I'm like, by whom? Whose kid is that? And they go, he goes, well, that kid wasn't from around here. And I like, what are you trying to say? It wasn't from around here. And he pointed to this guy. He says he was one of them. They dropped him off here and wanted me to teach him some stuff about, Earth life or whatever. And then, eventually after a number of months, they came back and got him. We're like, okay. I mean, that's how weird it got. Okay. uh,
Well,
so,
I know there were many, many things, and I've heard a lot of them, but yeah, just tell us some of the strangeness that happened when you were doing this investigation and we go visit with Oscar.
okay. Uh, one of the weirdest things was I was up there with one of the investigators. And one of the strange things I've got to say that's very strange is Oscar, for 99% of those 7 years that I was investigating him, he did not have a phone. We couldn't call him up and go, hey, you gonna be around tomorrow? We'd like to come up and visit. And he's like, yeah, well, just, come on up here and I'll sit down and talk to you if I can. So he never ever had a phone. And all the times that I went up there, he was always there. And he would stop whatever he was doing and he would sit down at a picnic table outside of his house, or if it was cold, we'd sit at his kitchen table. We would talk for 4 hours. His wife would bring us snacks and drinks, and it didn't matter what was going on. He would stop and he would talk to us and never act like we were putting him out at all. And he was always there every time that we went up there, except for one. And actually, well, here's how that story goes. It was myself and Bruce Wedeman, and then an experiencer that I had been working with in Illinois at the time. That and I'll tell you the story about her in a minute, because she got involved with this case in an interesting way. So we went up there to talk to him, and it was nighttime. We pulled into his driveway, and the house was dark. And so it was like, oh no, he's not here. It's the first time this has ever happened. And the lady that was with us says, no, go up and knock on his door. I think he's here. But not only was the house dark, but there was no, you couldn't see like an LED light on the coffee machine on. There was nothing. There was like the electricity in the house was off. There was no power in the house, period. So we went up, knocked on the door, and nobody came to the door for a minute or so, knocked again, and then we started seeing this pale green glow coming out of like the windows in the house, like as if somebody was carrying like a little pale green lantern, and they were walking from room to room inside the house, and you could see the light, in the window. And then it came to the front door and opened the front door, and it was him. And we're like, oh, we didn't think you were home. And he goes, well, I wasn't. He says, but when you guys showed up, they brought me back. That started that conversation. We're like, okay, well, we'd like to talk, but we understand, if you're busy. And he's like, no, it's, I can talk. And so we sat at the picnic table outside of his house in the dark. And he explained to us that that him and his wife both had like forgotten to pay the power bill and they shut off the power. Like, okay, that's kind of the way this guy lived. Just, just sort of a nomadic lifestyle, if you will. There's nothing fancy about his lifestyle or his house or anything. And so we sat there in the relative darkness. There was enough starlight, moonlight, whatever you want to say, where you could see each other sitting around the picnic table. It wasn't quite bright enough to like be able to take notes, but you could, once your eyes adjusted, you could see each other fairly well. So we sat at the picnic table and we talked and we talked. And at one point, I'm sitting directly across from him at the picnic table. And Bruce is sitting, I want to say Bruce was sitting on the next to him on the same side of the picnic table. And then this lady, we'll call her Debbie, was sitting on the same side with me. And we're talking to him, and his voice and his mannerism started to shift. And we had seen this before, and he had indicated when that happens that the aliens were actually listening in and could talk through him also, like, using him sort of like a medium or a channel, if you will. And while we're talking to him, and again, he's not 3 feet away from me, right across the picnic table, this pale green glow appears over his face. And it was as if there was like, sort of a pale green mist, like it almost looked like glow in the dark paint. It's that kind of really gentle glow, appeared like a haze across the front of his face. I could still see his face through this, but I was seeing this green image, if you will. And within a minute or so, that green mist turned into the image of somebody else's face. And it was like, a slide projector or something was projecting it against sort of a mist in front of his face is kind of what it looked like. And the image of the face started to change, like it flipped, as if you were going through a slide presentation. It flipped to a different face, and then another face and another face, and it went through about 7 or 8 faces, different faces. And some were male, some were female, and they were clear enough where you could tell, oh, that guy looks like he's about 50. Oh, that guy looks like he's, in his mid-20s. I mean, you could distinctly recognize the face, and you could tell, kind of what age they were. That's how clear it was. And so I'm like nudging Debbie, and I'm going, are you seeing this? And she's going, yeah, I can see it. And Bruce is sitting over here going like, what are you talking about? And I go, well, there's these green projected faces over Oscar's face. And so Bruce looks at him and he goes, well, I can't see it. But he says, what I can see is like what it looked like a little line, if you will, like if you were looking from the side, like just a little line of a green glow. And so it'd be like he's looking at the edge of the screen. Debbie and I were looking across it more at the front of the screen, and we were seeing these. And so we were like, Oscar, what's going on? What is this? And he goes, well, those are the crew members that I was visiting with before you guys got here and that are participating in this conversation. And so then that went on for a little bit. We continued to talk about, I can't even vaguely remember all the things that we talked about. Not that night or even through the whole investigation. It was just anything and everything you can imagine, from state of affairs on Earth to state of affairs with the aliens, with, politics, religion, bigotry, just every imaginable topic, So
Well, tell us some of the insight that you got about this particular alien race why they were staying in touch with him? I don't know if he was able to tell you that or not, or what were they doing here, and why were they contacting him, and what did they want him to tell you guys, if anything?
Well, their point of origin, according to whenever he was involved in the initial crash retrieval, there was star map information on the one of the panels inside the craft or whatever. And the alien verified also that their assumption was accurate, that they came from the two different star systems, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. So those are our names for those star systems. You can look them up. They're very real. They're, interestingly enough, those are star systems that other experiencers and abductees have reported aliens coming from. They're, like I say, they're very human in appearance. They tend to be stockier and heavier, like a more body mass, but they're kind of stocky, but in appearance, they look just like us. Most of the time, they have sort of a short Roman style haircut, if you will, like ancient Rome, where they cut their hair kind of short, like almost like a crew cut, close knit to their head. That was a very typical look for these beings. One of the interesting things that Oscar brought up was that they have connected earlobes. And this is an odd conversation that I had with him, because I had asked him one time, I says, well, you don't know us from Adam. Why do you trust us to come up here and tell all your secrets too? I said, these are things that if they get out, people could come up here and want to harm you or, whatever. And he looked at me and he says, I know I can trust you because of your earlobes. And I go, what? And he's like, yeah, you have connecting earlobes like the Tau Cetians. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's that's my ticket to be trusted by you, is because I have the ears like the Tau Cetians. So as a sort of a silly story, if you will, but that was one of the reasons that he liked me right off the bat. So he actually had a picture of Hank that he snuck out of the base before he was ousted out of there. And I do have it someplace. I don't know if I can pull it up. I can send you some of this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, send me a copy of that. I've seen it, and it does look very human.
Yeah, it does. And so as far as their agenda was concerned, I mean, they're basically, we're related to them in some senses, and that they have a vested interest in our survival and our success. And it seemed like they were down here, they're trying to help. In the particular case of this craft, it was unclear whether the craft crashed on its own or it was shot down, but our assumption was that, and Oscar's also, was that the craft was shot down, which did not make the aliens very happy, obviously, especially if they're trying to look out for us. But how our military industrial complex is, they have an agenda. And so here's an interesting addendum to this story that came completely outside of my circles. Was years later, whenever I had originally publicly talked about this speech and or about this case, and then also Wendell Stevens had a magazine at the time when he was alive. That at the time that I told this story, there were only two other people that he knew of, or that anybody else knew of, that had reported contact with beings from Tau Ceti. And he had a case, and Bill Hamilton had a case. And so Wendell Stevens was real interested in it, and him and I ended up becoming friends just because of this case. It brought us together. And so as the word got out, like Wendell, I wrote an article about Oscar's case that Wendell published in his magazine. And I went up and I asked Oscar, I said, look, I would like to I would like to write about your case, but I don't want to do it without your permission because it'll certainly bring you unwanted attention. And he goes, well, write the article, it's okay. And I go, well, before I do anything with it, I'll bring it up here and let you look at it, make sure you approve. And he's like, yeah, okay. So after I wrote it, I took it up there to him and I handed it to him. And it was, 7 or 8 pages or whatever. And he just kind of looked at it and threw it down on the table and he says, that's good, it's perfect, go ahead and publish it. And I go, you didn't even read it. He goes, I didn't need to. I didn't need to. He says, I know that it's right. And I'm like, okay, well, this was part of some evidence over the years that we came to the conclusion that he couldn't read, that he was illiterate. He never had any printed material in his house, not a TV guide, not a newspaper, not a magazine. And anytime any of us asked him to read something, he did the same thing. He just kind of looked at it and laid it down and didn't read it. And so we eventually questioned him on it. We didn't question him like, hey, are you illiterate? But it was like, hey, how come you're okay with all this written stuff? And he goes, well, he says, I know what's in it. He says, I'm informed of what's in that stuff before you bring it up here. I don't need to read it. We're like, okay. So anyway, so the word gets out back in the 90s. I was talking about this case, and I meet somebody at a conference. They come up to me and they go, hey, I know a woman who's a UFO investigator in the Northwest, and she has a similar story to your story about Oscar. And he says that what she said was that she became aware that there was this crash retrieval operation that was taken to this, apparently some kind of a facility that's near Minot. It's not Minot proper, but it's in the vicinity there. It's, a secret underground research facility or whatever, that they had a craft there and that they had an alien from Tau Ceti, and that the alien had died during some of these experimental surgeries and stuff they were doing on him, and that the source aliens, the other Tau Cetians or whatever, got real upset about it, and they came down and they met with the officials at that base and said, look, we want the body back. We came to get the body of our comrade, whatever, our fellow traveler. And at first the military refused, and she heard that there was a sort of a small confrontation between them, between the aliens and our military. And ultimately the aliens got the body of Hank back and took it with them. So what was interesting about her story was not only does the timeline match, but these basic details, also dovetail into exactly what Oscar had told us. And one of the things, when Oscar had gone to the military hospital out east to be debriefed after he got out, him and his father, he told his dad what had happened. And they went to North Dakota and they hiked into the perimeter of the base. Now, this is a guy whose job was security around such things. So not only did he know, where to get in, but he also knew that he was going to run into guards, and he knew he was going to run into guards that he knew. And so they purposefully hiked in, the perimeter of the base such that they would be confronted by guards. And they were friends of Oscar's that he had worked with when he was there. And he asked them, he says, all I want to know is, I'm not here trying to cause any trouble or get in. All I want to know is what happened to Hank. And the guard said, he died a couple of months ago. So that was a real interesting side story that I heard, from this other person.
Did Oscar ever say in the debriefing and all of that time that he spent, did they not want him to talk about this at all? Did he ever express that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, it was a very aggressive, debriefing. Uh, he said, they used chemically induced hypnosis and all kinds of stuff to get him to not talk about it. And he said he didn't for a long, long time. And, but, eventually, he had some friends like his neighbor that you're sitting around a campfire and he's like telling his story or whatever. And then next thing you know, there's 4 UFO researchers banging on your door, right? So, uh, I think that we were the first people that he told the whole story to, and that he, uh, let us keep coming up and visiting him and sort of continuing this saga. Uh, I have no doubt in my mind that what he was saying about still, especially about still being in touch with these beings was true, because there's so much weird stuff happened when we were up there. And we were able to verify that even though, he was like a Delta team, high security kind of a thing, we were able to verify that he was in the military during the period of time that he said. And he said he was part of a crew called Turner's Rangers, and named after their commanding officer, Colonel Turner, I guess. And we were able to verify the existence of that person, that he was in charge of a Delta squad, and that Oscar was part of that. I mean, so his military background, we were able to verify. And one of the researchers who's really good at digging stuff like this up was able to find who we think Professor Bear was, that he was a real person. His last name is Bear. And the strange sort of educational background that he had, and him being associated with other projects like at Los Alamos and a couple of other places. So we're pretty sure that guy existed out there and was associated with this project. Um, so uh, one of the other weird things, I'm sorry, that same night that we were sitting there, the night of the green faces, at one point while this was going on, um, all of a sudden, all sound stopped. Like, we're sitting outside in a rural community. There's crickets and frogs and coyotes and any manner of night sounds going on. Just this cacophony of, nighttime animal sounds because there's just woods all over the place around there. And just all of a sudden, it just all went dead silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. I mean, you hear about these things, but until you experience them, it is a really creepy feeling. I mean, that just makes the hair on on your body stand up. You're like, oh man, what just happened? What's going on? And then that was like that for a couple of minutes, and then all of a sudden, all the dogs in that whole county just started barking viciously at the same time. All the neighbor dogs, as far as the ear, could hear dogs just barking, 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 just going crazy. And at the same time that was happening, we heard this sound coming from the sky. Now this is nighttime, clear, starlit sky. We heard this sound. I'll try and imitate it as best I can, but it kind of sounded like a jet engine sound, but really deep and coming from far away. It was sort of like a up in the sky, and you could hear where it was coming from. And like, you could look up and go, the sound is coming from there and it's moving across this way, like very, very slowly, this big sort of jet sound in the sky or whatever. But it was moving very, very slowly. You couldn't see anything. So like, when I'm looking up, I can see where this thing should be. Like, you can hear it coming from over here in the sky. Um, and I couldn't see anything. Bruce couldn't see anything. Debbie, on the other hand, she's like, oh my God, how big is that thing? We're like, what? And she's like, we can't see anything. She goes, I can see something. And what she described it was, she said it looked like the city of Detroit flying through the sky, but upside down. So like all this detailed structure of like buildings, it's the best way to describe it, is it looked like a city floating through the sky, with all the buildings pointing down and some pointing up. It was just this gigantic craft. And we're like, well, we can't see it. We can hear it. And we're like, how big is it? And she was like, I can't see all the sides of it. It's so big. And so we nicknamed that the Detroit ship, because that's how she described it, as looking like the city of Detroit floating in the sky.
Was Oscar there at the time when she saw that?
Yeah, he was sitting right across from me. That was when we were looking at the green faces. That was going on, and then the whole environment changed. The dogs started barking, this thing, whatever it was, coming across the sky. And like I say, Bruce and I couldn't see anything except the stars, but she was, and later she tried to draw it. And I think it was one of the books that Lisa Dusenberry did, where she had drawn something like that somebody else reported. It was her or somebody down you guys' way. And so whenever I saw that in that book, I showed it to Debbie, and she goes, because she tried to draw it, she just wasn't a very good artist, And when I showed that to her, she was like, yeah, that's what it looked like, which looked like a city floating in the sky.
Could Oscar see it?
Yeah, I'm sure he did. He didn't turn around and look. He just sat there and kept talking to us while we're all pointing and looking over his shoulder and stuff. And he was obviously very aware that it was there. We didn't say, hey, did you see that thing? It just seemed like a silly question to ask him. It's like he obviously knew what was going on.
Do you think this was the ship that he would meet with the aliens on?
Potentially. I don't that part, he didn't talk in great detail about that part of it, other than most of the time I think the communication with him was telepathic, not necessarily on board, but he obviously claimed to have been on board a couple of times. And actually, if we can rewind to Debbie's story, okay, I'll interject another strange bit in there with her. I was working on her completely separately. There's no relation in the two cases whatsoever. But when I was working with her, she attested to having, because of or a consequence of her contact experiences, or her abduction experiences or whatever, that she developed some abilities, some psychic abilities, one of which she said, oh, I'm a really good dowser. I'm like, oh yeah. And she's like, yeah, you can test me anytime you want. She says, I can douse anything. She was just really, really proud of her dowsing ability. So one of the times we were up there with Oscar and we were talking to him, he told us this story about how he ended up living in the house that he was living in. And him and his wife were living in a different house, in that same rural community, basically in that same area. And he says one day this person comes to his house and knocks on the door and says, we have something for you. And they said, we have a piece of property that we want to give you, a house to live in. And it was apparently, a nicer place to live than they were at the time. In fact, I think he was looking for, a place to live in this, a different place to live or whatever. And this person just shows up and goes, here's a deed to our house. We want you to have it. And he's like, why would you do that? Why would you, one, what? Who are you? Why did you come here? Well, and find me? None of it made sense to him. And he says, why would you just give me your house? What are you going to do? And they go, oh, we're just going to go live somewhere else. And they said, because we were told that you need to live in this house. And they gave him the deed and they disappeared and he moved into this house. And so, like, if that isn't strange enough, it's like, okay, well, since you've lived here, did you figure out why you were supposed to live in this house? And he goes, yeah, he said, the energy situation here is much more conducive to the aliens being able to communicate with me. So it's much easier in this spot for me to communicate with them. And he said there's ley lines. There's 3 ley lines that intersect and form a triangle around this property, which sets up a unique energy situation that makes it easier for communication. And so we were outside. He goes, there's right over here next to where the road and the corner of the property comes, there's a ley line intersection there. And then that one goes back in here and this one goes over here. And then they intersect behind this tree line over here. They intersect over there in a field. And that's where I go to communicate with the aliens, is I go and I sit in that field and we can talk. It's, you know, that's sort of like, that's where the phone booth is. So we're like, okay. So after Debbie told me this, I get this bright idea that, okay, so I've got a person who tells me he's got ley lines intersecting on his property. Those should be pretty easy to dowse, right? And I've got a person claiming to be an expert dowser. Well, let's put these 2 together and see what happens, right? So normally we would go up on the weekend or in the evening to interview him. But one day I was off work. Debbie was a stay-at-home mom. I was like, hey, I want you to meet somebody. She knew nothing about this person or this case. We had not been talking about it publicly at all. And Oscar knew nothing about her as well. So I took her in the car and we drove up there. And I went up and banged on the door and he wasn't there. This was literally the only time he wasn't there. His wife answered the door and he goes, oh, hi. He goes, oh, Oscar's at work. He's not here right now. And so I explained to her, I introduced her to Debbie and I said, I just really wanted her, she's had experiences. I wanted her to meet Oscar and see, see what happened when I put the 2 of them together or whatever. And she's like, well, you guys can hang around until he gets off work or just, feel free to make yourself at home. And I go, do you mind if we walk around, the yard or the property or whatever? And and she's like, no, do whatever you want to do. So Debbie gets her dowsing rods out and I tell her to, I was like, get your dowsing rods out. I want you to douse and tell me what you find. She's like, what am I looking for? And I go, I'm not going to tell you anything. Just douse and you tell me what you find. It's like, oh, okay. So she starts dowsing and she goes, oh, there's a ley line here. It runs this way. And she dowses down that ley line and she comes to the corner of the property line. She goes, oh my God, there's an intersection here. There's this just swirling, whirlpool of energy here, and that ley line goes off that way. And so we're just walking around and she's doing this thing with her dowsing rods. And we end up on the other side of that tree line in this open field, which none of us had ever walked over there before. He had just told us about it. She was just following the ley line and we ended up over there and she came to that intersection of the ley lines in the middle of that field. And she just dropped her dowsing rods to her side and she looked at me and she goes, oh my God, this is where he comes to talk to the aliens. Now, she knew nothing about this case, nothing about this guy, didn't know anything about why we were up there. Okay, I was keeping this as double negative as you can possibly get. And that's what came out of her mouth. And she goes right here, this is the spot where he comes to communicate with the aliens. And I'm like, okay, I'll be damned, right? So then we took her back. Bruce and I took her back the next time to actually meet him. And that's whenever it was the green faces and the flying city in the sky and all that stuff happened. So
wow. Now,
yeah.
I know, she had her own experiences too. Did she feel like she had the same people, the same aliens that she was in contact with as him?
That's a good question. Generally speaking, I would say no. The, the beings and stuff that she reported were more your typical grays. She wasn't necessarily having negative or frightening experiences, but they were different than his. So, but he had no problem with her coming up there, and she was obviously tuned into whatever was going on up there, and they got along fine.
Well, so
So,
obviously you spent a lot of hours talking to Oscar, and a lot of different subjects came up, as you said. And of course, you'd had one kind of avenue of understanding aliens in with the investigations you've done, the reading you've done. Was he well informed about other people's contact with aliens or other people's experiences, like the Betty Barney Hill case or the Roswell crash or anything like that?
actually, no. He did not appear to know anything about any of that kind of stuff. He lived a very, very sheltered life. Um, he was, we did have conversations about that sort of thing, as like him not knowing, much about anything that was going on in the world, really. And he basically just says, "Oh, if I need to know something, they'll tell me. And if I don't, they won't." And, you know, he just,
Did he indicate his very first real knowledge of contact was when he met this the nickname Hank the alien? Was that his very first knowledge of them, or had he had other contact before that?
well, that was what started his waking contact with them, but it was pretty evident that he had other kinds of experiences when he was younger as well. It kind of feeds back into the idea that none of that kind of stuff's an accident. Like him being part of that crash retrieval team and all of that sort of, was set in motion whenever he was younger. But he didn't really recall or remember any of that until after he made the contact with Hank, and then they kept talking to him. So,
Did you feel, or did he feel that his position with the military, that somehow the military may have known of his early contact?
he never did say anything to that effect. So I don't know. Yeah, he never indicated that, like, that they picked him because of that, but I do know that there is some of that sort of thing that does go on in the military, that people are sort of targeted because of their either their background, their associates or whatever, and then they're led down a career path, if you will, to put them in the right place to be involved in this thing. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think we're going to have to end our discussion today, but I know you have a wealth of information about other cases. We'll have to have you back on for another period of time sometime.
no problem. Do you have time for one last quick story about Oscar?
I have all night. I'll listen all night. I thought maybe you needed to go, but yeah, for sure.
Well, I kind of do, but I'll leave you with one more tidbit of that happened. Well, I was up there with another researcher one time, and we were sitting out in Oscar's backyard or side yard at the end of his driveway, which the back of his property was basically like a junkyard. There was, like weeds and trees growing up, but there was probably like 50 old cars out there, like it was a junkyard at one point, but it was almost completely overgrown, and a line of trees in the distant background. And we were sitting on like a little railroad tie wall or whatever, talking to him. And he was sitting facing us, and me and the other researcher were facing his backyard. So we're looking out at that tree line in the night sky and then the stars up above. And we're talking to him that particular night. We were talking to him sort of a lot about are the aliens aware of what UFO researchers are trying to do, or what they're up to or who they are, and that sort of thing. And he was affirming that they definitely pay attention to what UFO researchers are doing and how, what they're talking about, what the effects are, that's important to them to, sort of, pay attention to that. So the indication being that they pay more attention to us than we probably would want anybody to. And while we were talking to him, this bluish white light, about maybe 4 times the size of Venus on a good night, like this. So this was a really big, bright star-like object. Comes up from behind the trees in the distance and comes up into the sky, and then it just stops. So myself and the other researcher are seeing it because it basically is over his shoulder in the distance. And then it starts going back and forth. It would go across, and go across, and it would stop, and then it would go down, it would come back up. And in ufology, we call that the T maneuver. It's actually been reported a lot over the years by people of, kind of going back and forth and up and down. And so we're watching this, and so I ask Oscar, I go, hey, we got this thing going on in the sky back here. And he goes, yeah, I know. He didn't even turn around and look. He goes, yeah, I know. And I go, is that them? And he goes, yep. And I go, are they, what's going on? He goes, they're showing themselves to you and seeing how you react to it. And I'm like, well, tell them to come closer. I want a better look at the craft, than this blue light in the sky or whatever. And he's like, well, they'll do whatever they want to do, but that's what's going on. They're testing your reaction to them. And we're like, well, it's pretty cool. I want to see them, And so this goes on for probably 15 or 20 minutes. And then eventually it goes back down behind the trees and it doesn't come back up. It was getting pretty late at that point. So we leave, and we're driving back. And I turn to the other researcher and I go, wasn't that cool, that blue light that we saw in the sky? And they go, what blue light? And I go, you were sitting right there. You the blue light in the sky that we were talking to Oscar. And the other investigator goes, I didn't see a blue light. I saw a silver disc-shaped flying saucer. And I'm like, what? And they're like, you didn't see that? And I go, no, I just saw a bluish white light, a very bright bluish white light moving around. I didn't see no flying saucer. And they go, no, it was like pretty good size silver flying saucer is what they saw in the sky. And so then I really felt cheated, right? So this was a person that was sitting no more than a foot to my right. So we're both looking at the same object, and each of us saw something different. This is sort of a cool and unusual enough thing that Dr. John Mack wrote about it in his book. So I'm very, very proud of that I got a mention in John Mack's book because of that weird experience we had up there.
Exactly. Do you think that's common, that that we tend to see things differently, not only within the UFO community, but just, as a whole?
I hate to say it, but yeah, I think it's particularly true in the UFO phenomenon. And the same thing with, like, we were talking about Bigfoot, like I've heard other stories from other researchers that say the same sort of thing, is that you're not going to see them unless they want you to. I even had this conversation with Dr. Harley Rutledge back in the day, God rest his soul. Whenever all this stuff was going on in Piedmont, Missouri, I was doing a lot of camping in Missouri at the time. I was in Boy Scouts, and I had seen some UFOs. And because of what happened, I came to the conclusion that they must have known we were seeing them. And when I told that story to Dr. Rutledge, he says, I'll take it one step further for you. He says, based on my experience of being out in the field watching these things, he says, you're not going to see them unless they want you to. And that was Dr. Rutledge's opinion back in the 70s. Okay. So take that into account here with Bigfoot also, that the aliens, the Bigfoots, there's got to be a relationship there anyway, but they may have the ability to alter our perception at will. So that we are either gonna see what we want to see, what we or what we're ready to see and not anything else. And so in this particular case, I can't explain it. But we looked at the same thing and saw something different. And it's come up with some other very famous cases like the Billy Meyer case, where he would be out with people and he would go, there's a disc right over there in the sky, and they're looking, they're going, we don't see anything. And then somebody leans over and looks over his shoulder, and as they look over his shoulder, then the craft comes into view. If they're looking right next to his head, they can see it, but then if they move over a little bit to the left or right, then they can no longer see the craft. So it appears that they have the ability to manipulate our perception at will.
Yeah.
It's really hard to figure this thing out, I can tell you that.
It's hard to figure it out, especially with the human limitations that we have, because if things like that can happen that often, then it's difficult to have much of a true concept of what we're dealing with.
Right. You have to question yourself. You have to question what's going on. What are we really seeing or not seeing or perceiving? So yeah, it's hard enough figuring out, alien agendas and alien technology, much less if we can't see clearly the data, then it really makes it difficult. We have a hard job as ufologists.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, one step at a time and one story at a time, right?
Right. That's the thing. Like, I've never really focused on any one part of research. Like, I'm not just a physical trace guy or an abduction researcher or, whatever. To me, it's the only way we're going to understand this thing is to gather all of these stories, gather all of this information and testimony, and start weaving it together, see where the pieces fit together, and the puzzle picture will start to emerge. But we've got to look at all of it, every last bit of it. We can't throw anything out, no matter how bizarre it seems, or we might be missing a key piece to the puzzle.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and close our meeting tonight. I'll let you know when this comes out.
Great. Thank you, Linda.
Okay. Thank
Wonderful
you.
talking to you.